Hi, we're here with David Cuthbert, architect at Cutworks Architecture, right? Cutworks.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And talking more about the Chronicle sketchbook, but really going way back before it was a sketchbook when it was just a cantaloupe. So like I was telling you, the project started with a cantaloupe. Um, I was studying for my master's in Chicago at the School of the Art Institute. And they said, for your first assignment, you can do whatever you want. And I was like, I want to study a cantaloupe. So I took it visually. I started looking visually. So I started looking at the skin. I cut it in different sections and just looked at the cross sections. I extracted colors and that kind of stuff. I did a lot of experimentation with sketches, laser cutting, trying to digitally recreate the pattern, all of that kind of stuff. Um, and then a few patterns and motifs and colors kind of came out of it, and that's what distilled to the end of the project. So what you're looking at is the distillation of all of that experience. And I don't know how you want to go from there, what you want to ask me,
I mean, one of the,
if there's anything else you want me to express.
I mean, we can go along as we talk, but I think for me, one of the things that I was always curious about, looking at, and you talk about it as a, starting from a cantaloupe, but it really is a sort of family of melons and pumpkins, which are all out of that same family, and I think there's something I think fundamentally beautiful about that, and I think it's something that is worth investigating, because it begins to talk about us, if we made sort of these comparisons as persons and people, is that you can have these things that are all the same kind of vegetable. Is it even a vegetable? But they can all be very different. You can have pumpkins, which are very, very savory. Others which are more like squash, which are, that have these, a little bit more, watery, but more accepting of flavors. And then you have, cantaloupes, which can be extremely sweet, or even honeydew, and it's like they're all, if you saw a black and white photograph of them, they would almost appear identical,
Right.
but it's within
Right.
that profile, that sort of flavor profile, that sort of begins to unearth a lot of these different aspects of it. And so for me, when
Yeah.
you kind of started doing all those things, and you started your levels of investigation, and sort of extrapolation, the question that I had asked then, which you never did respond, I think you were, I think, a little bit unprepared for the question. um, and I think now that you've had some time, it might be better to ask it, is, was there a formal series of questions that you were actually doing, in terms of investigation? Because, you were looking at things in detail, you were doing things inverted, and the reason I was asking about, having those series of questions and those series of investigation, is that the output for me, I would have loved to have seen how the output would have changed depending on the type of melon it was. You know, if it was a pumpkin, this is what happened. If it was a honeydew, this is what happened. And while that may sound very, kind of like in the methodology of, sort of scientific research, I find that those are, to me, sometimes where the best art comes from. It's where things become, you know the the methodology as artists is sometimes these things that get lost, but it's
Yeah.
the things that we often study the most.
Right.
We like to pretend that we're just kind of these mythological, creatures that just do whatever we want, and we're just guided by the universe. But in fact, they're usually very clear things that we're doing. We just very rarely write it down, or very
Right.
rarely sort of put them in place. And they're I think being able to do that, I think, is very, very critical, for us to move chapters. Like we really can't.
Well, maybe I can answer. I don't know if it's an answer you'll be looking for. I don't. So I've actually had this question. I'll ask people, be like, why a cantaloupe? And I mean, I'll just answer as honestly as I can. Maybe there is something deeper than this, but I don't know. When I was 19, I was at my kitchen table. I think I was eating a mango. And I just looked at the skin and I was like, this thing is amazing. Like, I would just love to take some paint or whatever and just recreate the texture, the color, the whatever. And so it was like something that's just been in my head for a while where I was like, I just want to investigate fruits, like visually. It wasn't, and I just never did. And I think I never did also because I've never fully identified as an artist. And that's very interesting. I know that sounds that way. And like, it's like I'm only now kind of taking that title. But it was when I got to the School of the Art Institute, I was like, okay, I guess I'm an artist now. I don't know. So let me explore some of the things that I've been inclined to do before, but I just never felt like I either had the avenue or I knew how to, or even a reason, because life can also just be about survival and that kind of stuff. But here I am in this kind of incubator space of no, just do whatever you feel like. And I'm coming from architecture, so I'm kind of also used to thinking whatever I feel like needs to have like this particular purpose. But I told myself I want to try to free myself from these preconceptions and just follow my fancy. So that was where I said, let me bring this idea that's just been in my mind for like a decade, or more. And let me just see what could come of it. And I don't even know why I chose a cantaloupe first. I think I was looking at different fruits. Maybe I was drawn to the skin because long before I got into the flesh, there was just that interweaving pattern on the skin, which I think sometimes we don't pay attention to. And this is also why I liked the idea of investigating fruit. We eat it, right? We just eat it. We don't look at it. We don't say, wow, this thing is so beautiful. But if it was a light bulb, if it was a light fixture, it would be beautiful, right? But it's a piece of fruit, so we don't even look at it. And there was something about that interweaving of the skin that was just very intriguing to me. And then also I went into my mathematical mind. I was also taking a course in grasshopper, rhino. And so I went into my mathematical mind, and I don't think I was super successful, but I tried to see if I could create a calculation to recreate this netting as well.
Right.
So I would say maybe it was the skin that drew me in for a cantaloupe specifically, but it was also just the question. I think the deeper question was just how everyday things can go unnoticed, how everyday beautiful, intricate, amazingly designed things, because they're a part of nature, because they've always been a part of our life, can go unnoticed. And what happens when we notice them? Like that was probably the question. Yeah.
I think that's a great response, and I think I kind of like the rawness of that, I think no, because there oftentimes these things are a little bit too heady. And I think there's there's something that it's impassioned, it's real. It's nothing that you can necessarily identify all the bits and pieces, but it's no, okay, if we've identified that this is where the impetus started, how is it that we're now going to develop it? And you've spoken about using using analytical software with grasshopper, to try and find ways of trying to recreate it. But I throw back the question and say, okay, where's that documentation that begins to talk about all these steps of analysis and breaking down, and how could you apply them to the other pieces? Because as a I, like yourself, I wouldn't necessarily call myself an artist. I think in many cases, what I am is an observer, of art. I find myself, I'm a fanboy of many things, and I find art is one of those things, and I'm always brought up, and I'm always deeply intrigued by the process, and finding ways that I can encourage the process. I don't know if it's my teaching background, but I'm always kind of like, how can I instigate that sort of next step? How can I help be the catalyst? And it doesn't even necessarily need to be me. I mean, I'm just asking the questions for you to ask yourself. Like, could you use those same levels of that you were doing to the other sets of, fruit slash vegetables within that same, typology, and how does that begin to reflect? And I think it starts to affect things like, colors and variations and netting,
Mm-hmm.
because you talk about, cantaloupe has that very obvious netting, but you get to things like, a lot of the pumpkins that we get within the region, that netting is
Mm-hmm.
very much built into the skin. It doesn't actually
Right.
have a ridge. It's just, almost
Yeah.
like just a color variation more than anything else.
Right. Right.
In others, that netting is internalized, and how is all of those things, sort of taking place? And I could almost see this series of things that you could filter out and begin to describe. And I think it has great value, in just how we can open up our lens a little bit more when looking,
Right.
and I
I
think
think
you're
that's
at that cusp
amazing.
for it.
And you're still in teacher mode. You're still in teacher mode
I guess
because
so.
no, you are, because you talk about documentation. That's never been my thing.
Yeah,
but
it's the terrible
but
thing with all artists.
but documenting the process almost to try to see if a methodology can emerge is
Yeah,
interesting too. I think that's really, really interesting.
yeah. And I
Um,
think the reason why that I said all of that, and is that I know that a lot of the output for you has been about creating these sketchbooks.
yeah,
And I think in some ways, while it was a very natural outlet, I think in
yeah,
many ways it also was this hindrance, because
yeah,
I think once you begin to open up the avenues of investigations and what you're investigating, the output, I think, should respond to that. Like if you were, and I use the example, and it's just really funny sort of coming back, but you use this idea of this sort of interconnected lace, that was the cantaloupe. And if you looked at that natural output, to me, that would be more like a shawl, at the very end of it, like
well,
what should
what's
be.
interesting, and I will share the photos with you, and I will share the photos in the video. um the notebook was really more of a fluke.
Yeah.
The project was a thing without the notebook. I just was looking for a gift to make, and I was like, let me slap this pattern on because I have it.
Okay.
But the actual project that I developed, and I don't know, maybe you can find a photo I don't know if I have a photo, in the Dropbox. The original thing was I tried to interpret it into a tapestry.
Okay. Yes.
And it was a like ceiling length tapestry,
Mm-hmm.
where originally I wanted spaces where there were 3 layers, and the 3 layers kind of represented the different levels of investigation into the cantaloupe, how deep I went into the cantaloupe,
Okay.
in color and also motif, and they were laser cut designs into it. So the most back layer represented some of the shapes I had found once I cut it cross section wise, and that was overlaid with another set of shapes, and then that was overlaid with the netting. We also have to remember that you're in the middle of a master's degree, you have limited time, it doesn't really come out exactly how you intend. But honestly, this conversation is making me like, I need to resurrect this project and I need to like get back into it and just explore more freely. Know that 2020 has completely changed my life, and maybe I do have the freedom to just be an artist
Yes.
exploring things. But that tapestry design was originally what I had tried to translate it into. And then also teasing what it could be was art prints. I did also experiment with a lighting fixture. And then the books were also like, it was just teasing, because I think as much as I allowed myself to go free in that moment,
You
I'm
weren't.
still in designer mode. Like,
Yeah.
it needs to have a purpose, like
Yeah.
it cannot
Yeah.
just be pretty. It
You
needs to have
know,
a purpose.
and there's nothing wrong with that. There's I think there's a fundamental difference between being a designer and an artist.
Yeah.
I think the artist is allowed to be untethered. And a designer can be an artist, but they recognize that while they can be untethered at some point, there needs to be almost this antithesis, at some point
Yeah.
where you need to be able to take it into something that is materialized, and I use
Yeah.
materialized kind of loosely because it doesn't necessarily have to be a physical thing, but being able to
Mm-hmm.
use it for something, more than just art for art's sake. And again, there's
Mm-hmm.
nothing wrong with that. I think it's just you know, it it speaks a lot about your own development as an individual and as a creator. And
Mm.
I think it's something that you should not shy away from, and at times you need to just
You mean the
recognize that,
untethering?
yeah, I mean, there's untethering at times, but at the same time, you feel like you need to make it into something,
Yeah.
and just don't feel like it's a bad thing, just do
Mm-hmm.
it, follow up on it, just enjoy the fact that that's what you need to do,
Mm.
and you are okay, so
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Ah, thank you. Yeah, I
Yeah,
think I don't know how to be untethered,
well,
but that's
exactly.
a whole nother conversation.
I
That's a
know, but I
whole nother
think if,
conversation.
yeah, I think if you can, if it is that you can do it, and I think any one of us have these abilities to do something for a very short amount of time, is that if you know you're going to be untethered until X point, when it is that you have to make it
Right.
into a product, you will do it because you
Yes.
have that safety and security of knowing that you will be turning it into some product at a later date. So you won't
Right.
feel like you're just wasting your time or spinning your wheels,
Yeah.
which is that sort of designer's art, that you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. This is
Mm-hmm.
supposed to be a product, um, and it allows that the investigations, can have meaning. And I think,
Mm-hmm.
also just the whole idea of, documenting and programming the actual investigation allows um, that sort of freedom to be a little bit more controlled, which I think is really what all of this is going back to, that we are, in some way, things as designers, that we kind of like control in some way, shape, or
But if
form.
but we have to, it is the balance, right?
Yeah,
Because if we're going according to our programming, we also are kind of foregoing the opportunity for a new programming to emerge.
absolutely. I mean,
Like
and there's nothing wrong with that. I think
yeah.
um you don't know if you're doing, like jazz musicians, in like the 1960s, a lot of them were, classically trained. They were classically trained musicians, and a lot of persons thought that them doing jazz was a counterpoint to everything they had learned. But the reality is that there's no way they could have done jazz if they didn't understand the formality of classical music. And it's in the
Mm.
same way, like, you only
Mm.
realize that these things are some sort of a hindrance or finding another process unless you
Mhm.
have a process. You don't
And
know that
maybe
two
that's true.
exist unless you
Like
know that one exists.
that's true. Like I had this idea at 19, and maybe I had to go through architecture school before I could just free myself to
Absolutely.
like fully explore it in a
Yeah,
way that I did. That's interesting.
absolutely.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
I don't know. Is there anything else that I can share with you? Anything else that you want to ask?
I don't know. I
Or
mean, I'm always, as I said, I'm a big fan. So I'm very curious to see exactly where this is going. I want to see what you're doing right now. Like I know
uh,
the
I'm
designers and
experimenting
artists
with
are,
charcoal right now.
yeah, great.
Yeah, it's just a
In a
mess. But
traditional
yeah.
sense.
In a traditional sense, what do you
Yeah.
mean?
I mean, are you using it the way that we're taught to use it, or are you
Charcoal?
experimenting
No.
with the media?
No, I am using it as intuitively. So here's the thing. I may be more of an artist now than a designer.
Hmm.
And maybe that's what this year has been for me. And I've found that on different levels, not just with creating, but just in life in general. Like I surrendered to the absolute um, unpredictability of the year 2020. And in that surrendering, I was just like, okay, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm gonna just feel through it. And so with this experiment with charcoal, I've also done like I'm taking my mind out of it. I'll come out of the shower dripping wet. Actually, yesterday I rubbed my hair on the paper and then was doing charcoal and like whatever. It was like I'm just experimenting intuitively with
Great.
this thing, not trying to draw something that looks like a thing, just trying to feel it as an extension of me. Um, so that's probably where I'm going right now. I don't know,
Mm.
David, because I also, yes, there's a part of me that wants to make it something, but then there's also the part of my identity as a designer and as a human that makes me think, have I been so programmed in my life that I haven't given myself space to really explore the vastness of what's possible? And
Yeah.
so it's like, that's kind of like where I am right now.
But you know that that becomes kind of one of those mysteries of the universe. We
It's
talk
like,
about
yeah.
how vast is the universe,
Mm,
and it is the only way that you can define how vast something is by some type of limit.
mm-hmm.
But we also recognize that the universe is, exponentially
Yeah,
expanding.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
how
yeah.
do you define how vast something is if it's constantly expanding? Like, what is your point of
Yeah.
reference? So in this search for indefinite evolution of yourself, um, where do you stop to say that you have evolved? And it's not about ed, but rather about the
Yeah.
ing. It's that you are
Mm,
evolving.
mm,
You are, and it's the same way what you said about the art. It's that
mhm,
you were doing. You weren't trying to figure out what
mhm,
it was going to be at the end, but you were just doing.
mhm,
And as that fundamental thing, as designers, we always talk about, you have some who search for completion, others who search for perfection, but they're both kind of fixed destinations,
mhm.
versus somebody else who's just caught in just the doing, just let's
Yeah.
just create, and that's okay. Um, and I think there is the dichotomy, is going to bring about beautiful things. Um, and I think you need to be, I think, aware of it, aware of the process at all times. So you have to play both
Mhm.
the agitator, the artist, and the observer. Which I know is a
That
little bit
takes
difficult.
discipline.
That takes a
That
little bit of discipline.
yeah.
It's I remember all these stories about a lot of artists, um, a lot of new artists, and sort of artists working in new medias, and even things about Richard Serra, who was creating these things in paper, and he would have his camera, black and white camera right next to him, and he
Mm,
would just be tearing things and trying to assemble, and he'd think he'd be on a path, and he would just stop and just take a photo, because he really acknowledged that he really didn't necessarily know where he was going, and the photographs helped, for a
mm,
sense of analysis at the end of the day, to really sort of figure out, you know, where the hell was he going, or
mhm.
really was, where he ended up, was that where he actually thought, it allowed
Mhm.
for, sort of a critical reflection. So,
Mhm.
allow yourself the space to do that.
Mhm.
And it may be something as simple as taking a photo every now and then, not a photo
Yeah.
to try and make this perfectly documented thing, but just a
Right.
photo so that it's there. Scanning the work also is really good.
Right.
Just whatever you can, and also allow others into the space, so that it
Mm,
forces you to describe, not necessarily
mm,
explain, but to describe where you are.
mhm.
So yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. And
Thank you
remember
for
that
that.
all of
I'll
the other
arrange. I'll
factors,
arrange a little. I'll arrange a little critique with you, for my charcoal drawings.
yeah, and that's I'm
But
always
yeah,
I'm always available, and things like that,
yeah.
is that to also remember the other things that you would have been influenced by, um, through these many other hats that you've worn, throughout your time, as a student of architecture, as a student of design, you know things of light and form and mass and weight and airness, like all of those factors still come into play, and use those as filters on what it is that you're doing, as ways of looking, ways of interpreting, ways of creating. They still have values, and that's what makes up Cherise, and whatever hat that she's wearing at that point in time, that those things are also quite influential in the final product.
Oh my gosh, thank you.
Yeah.
I feel like you see me.
No comment.
But thank you. No. Okay. It's funny because when we started this conversation, I really was just thinking, all right, this is just wrapping up this sketchbook part of my life, yada, yada. But you've really created a sort of a curiosity in me for me to be like, yeah, wrap up the sketchbook, but the originating project,
Yeah.
or the originating process that was emerging from that project. How can I explore that more? And I like that. I want to be an artist at times.
Well, there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, you're in a space that you are defining.
Yeah.
You are what you are. There's,
Yeah.
only you can say what that is. And if you want to look back at things that you have, and as I said, you said it, you have a curiosity in these things, or, a curiosity has been awoken. The people who are observing it have a curiosity. We are curious on what these things are, and, where they're going and what's going to happen, So, yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I feel like that's a nice conversation.
I think so too.
Thank you so
You're most
much.
welcome.